Hi, I'm Andrea and welcome back to my writing channel. Today we're going to be talking about my current work in progress, but instead of the first draft, we have officially moved on to revisions. A few weeks ago I made a video recapping the first draft and how everything went and sort of what I was feeling at the end of the first draft. So if you want to start with that video, you can click here or the link is in the description box below and you can watch that video first. It's been a few weeks now since I finished the first draft and I'm officially ready to start revisions. I've actually already started revisions. When I say starting revisions, I don't mean I've actually started like taking apart the book or anything, but what I've mainly been doing is kind of the first steps of revisions. I'm going to talk you through what my sort of plan is for this novel, for my revisions of this novel. I'm not saying this is the way to do revisions. I'm not even saying it's the way for me to do revisions because every writer is going to have their own process and what works really well for them. Personally, I'm still figuring out mine. But today I wanted to walk you through this plan, kind of tell you the areas of the book that I really feel like I need to work on and how I'm going to go about it. All right, so in that first draft video that I linked you before, I told you a little bit about the story. I did not tell you the working title because I don't want to say that just yet because I'm afraid I'm going to get really attached to the title and I'm not going to be able to change it later if it needs to be changed. So I'm calling it my Eliana story because my protagonist's name is Eliana. I also told you that my two, I guess, secondary main characters, my two next important characters after Eliana are Dorian and Tamaris, and that's kind of as far as I got in terms of actual details. And I did tell you a little bit about the plot, the story. It's fantasy, it takes place in a fantasy world, but our world does exist, so the protagonist comes from our world, and she does kind of a foreign exchange, a study abroad in this fantasy world. So that's kind of the premise of the book. But one key thing that I have really wanted to develop in my revisions, and I've already started, and I still have some more work to do, but that is in the world building of the fantasy world. My outline was really detailed, to be fair. I did a lot of like brainstorming and world building and all of that before even touching the first draft, before even writing the first chapter, because I know it's so important for writing fantasy in general. World building is one of the key things. You can't even have really a convincing plot or convincing characters if you don't have at least some world building details. So I have a lot of that already mapped out, and I had a lot of it before I even started the first draft. But there were certain elements of it that I kind of left a little bit vague. Like, for example, I didn't have a map. I didn't know exactly how this fantasy world was laid out, and I also didn't know a lot about the cultures in the fantasy world, the languages in the fantasy world, all things that are very important to me as a writer and that I really wanted to be in the story. Not saying that I'm going to actually invent languages, that's not happening, I'm not a linguist, but I just wanted these cultures to exist and to be present in the writing, even if it's subtle, even if not all of the details that I'm coming up with and that I'm creating are going to actually be written into the story or even, you know, factor into the plot. They just need to be there to make this world more of a reality to the readers and more enchanting. I want to enchant readers. I want them to want to dive into the pages, and I want this world to come alive to them in the way that it kind of has in my own head. So a lot of the details that I want to incorporate in revisions are going to be world building details. So that's where I've started. I have spent so much time just creating all of this background of my fantasy world. I mentioned on Instagram stories that I also made a map for my world, which is a first actually. I've done like really vague sketches before, but I'm so bad at sketching. I am not a visual artist, which is weird because I'm a very visual person, but I absolutely cannot transfer what's in here to the page. I'm just not a sketch artist, I'm not a painter. So I did a search online for some different apps that I could use to sort of make this world, but where I wouldn't have to do it by hand. And the one that I found, not sponsored by the way, I just happened upon this, but I found Incarnate, and I just tested out the free version. I haven't done any paid versions or anything yet because I'm not sure how detailed I really want to go. I just wanted to have kind of the basics of my map laid out, and that's what I've been playing around with. So I do actually have a map now, and that's helped greatly actually for me to get this in my head, even though my story doesn't really take place in a vast geographical landscape. It's kind of centered in one small corner of this world, but I wanted the rest of it to be there. And I have characters who come from different parts of my fantasy world. So as I'm developing their backstories and their cultures and their languages and all of that, I want to know kind of where everything is and how it's all set up. Another really important world building element is my magic system. There is a kind of magic in my fantasy world. It's not the like spells and incantations and sorcery type of magic. It's much more abilities. So kind of more like a superpower, except that it's much more limited, and I'm coming up with my own structure, categorization, sort of, you know, the background of this magic. I'm making it very unique. I'm not reinventing the wheel. I don't think it's necessary for fantasy to reinvent the wheel with every magic system. In fact, it might be kind of impossible because there are just so many different types of fantasy books. And at one point, you gotta be able to compare the magic that you're using with some other fantasy book, and that's no problem. But I just want it to be unique to my world. I want to add some sort of singular quality to mine, to where if a reader tried to explain how magic works in my book, they wouldn't just say it's superpowers, or they wouldn't just say it's like Harry Potter. I want them to be able to differentiate my magic as it is in my book. I want it to feel different within my book, how it works in my book, how the world functions around it. All those things can be unique. Already I had a lot of this done, again, because I couldn't have written my first draft without it. I had a lot of abilities defined, what people could and couldn't do. I also have an academy system within my book because it is kind of like a study abroad. I had to explain the different academy systems, and basically different types of abilities go to different academies. That makes sense. Kind of like degree specializations in the real world. Even more so in revisions though, I really want to develop the different types of abilities, how they function in the world, because I had some of that, but I didn't have it fully developed outside of what I needed to have developed. So that's world building. There's other stuff, of course, that I could talk about, but I'm just gonna stop there for now because those are kind of the highlights of the different aspects that I want to work on and I have been working on. Next, there is character development, which I mentioned also in that last video that this was something that I really wanted to work on. I have really strong characters, and especially my protagonist, I think her arc is present there, but I really need to refine that arc, and even more so, I need to work on the character arcs of my secondary main characters. There has to be a better way of saying that, but you know what I mean. Dorian and Tamras are the two that I'm talking about. And of course my villain, which I also mentioned in my last video, is really, really important. I want a really strong, good villain, and that's actually what I was working on this morning, so it's kind of fresh in my head. I've been working on my villain's arc. Kind of the two steps that I'm separating this into is making sure I have their arc very, very well defined to me. So making the notes in my notes documents. I mentioned before I use Evernote, and I have different notes within a notebook for my story, and each of those notes goes into different details about different things. So basically I want to make sure I have all my details of this character's arc in their character profile. That's the first step. Then the second step is making sure that character arc actually makes it into the story, because I think this is a little bit of what I need to work on with Dorian, for example, is one of the key things. I had his arc in my head, I had most of it in my notes, but I'm not entirely sure all of it made it into the story. So I'm working on ways that I can make sure it's very present, foreshadow in the ways that I need to foreshadow, things like that that I wasn't necessarily thinking about primarily when I was writing my first draft, because I was focusing on my protagonist, because I was focusing on my scene development and the places and making sure I have good descriptions and sort of building my story in a way, you know, the pacing. There's so many things that you're focusing on in a first draft. So his arc is there, but I'm not entirely sure it's as present as it could be. Really, if I had to sum up what I've spent the majority of my time doing so far in revisions, it has been brainstorming and development, all behind the scenes stuff. I've just been diving into the story, I'm rereading the story, I'm making little notes as well because I use Microsoft Word for my draft. I've made a new document for my revisions draft. I've saved my first draft separately, and I'm making kind of notes using the comment feature in Microsoft Word. So I'm saying, you know, add this here, add this there. Once I've developed something about the world, if I think, you know, a really good place to incorporate those details or to sort of subtly work those into my story, the actual story, I'll make a little note. I'm not doing it just yet. I'm not actually diving into the draft and changing a bunch of stuff because I really want to wait. I don't want my impatience to let me do something stupid. I have said it before and I'll say it again. I am a very impatient person, and the entire process of writing doesn't really go with my personality. It has taught me so many things about myself, and it's challenged me in so many ways, because you can't be an impatient person when you're writing. So impatient people have to learn how to get themselves under control and be patient. I've been making comments and I've been trying not to actually dive into the story yet, because if I end up changing a scene to incorporate a world building detail and then I realize actually a better place to incorporate that detail would be 2 pages before or 10 pages after, then I'm gonna have to rewrite again. So what I'm trying to do before I dive too much into it is make all my notes first. And the comment feature is actually really, really useful for this, because I can see where it's going to go, I can see what's going to happen and not forget that I intended to put something there. But if I need to move it, it's as easy as copy pasting and, you know, making another comment or moving a comment. So we've got world building, character development, all of that stuff happening in my notes document. We have notes being made, comments being made on the side of my actual story for where I want to incorporate those world building details, or where I think maybe I need to come back and relook at a scene or relook at a paragraph even. The other really key thing that I'm thinking about with these revisions are my scenes. Because I am a plotter and because I had a really detailed outline before, I think it's safe to say that all of my scenes do have a purpose. I know this is a problem with some people, I think especially for people who pants or who discovery write, where there may be scenes that aren't necessary or scenes that don't quite serve a purpose. That's not the case as much with outliners, I think, because we outline everything first, so we know kind of the order things need to happen. So each scene does have a purpose. Doesn't mean that I won't need to delete some scenes or combine or split some scenes. That's very, very possible. But at this point, I think all of my scenes really do play a purpose, and for the most part, they're where they need to be. I may need to move stuff around, like the order that they discover certain things might need to move a little bit, but the scenes are pretty solid, I think. The couple of parts that I want to work on are actually adding scenes. I've decided that there need to be at least 2 more scenes added in different parts with different purposes and even characters. One of the scenes kind of fills in the gaps of something that I kind of moved across and I wanted to kind of be subtle and implied, but then as I was developing things and working on things, I realized I don't think it's explicit to the reader if I don't actually have the scene in there. So I think I do need to add that scene. I'm gonna write it, I'm gonna put it in, and then when I'm done with all these revisions, I'm gonna read everything through, and then I will make the final call if that scene needs to be there or if I should just cut it. It's so painful to say that, to think about writing something and then possibly having to cut it, but I don't think that will be the case. I really think it's going to be a necessary scene. The other scene is something that is kind of completely added, but it does fill in the gap with something that's specifically character related. It's really about building a bond between 2 characters that really need to have this bond established, and I tried to show it through the scenes that I have, but I just don't think it's quite as strong as it needs to be. So there needs to be another interaction, another scene between these 2 characters to really solidify their development and their relationship together. So that's kind of going to be the primary purpose of that scene. I'm also hoping I can incorporate a little bit of plot in there as I'm developing the world and sort of filling in, not plot holes, but sort of, you know, filling in the gaps, because there are some gaps that I need to fill in. I think I can also get that into this scene and kind of make it have more than just one purpose. I think I've covered most of the bases of what I'm focusing on with my revisions. It's really development, note making, and, you know, little tiny changes and tweaks and stuff within the story to get that development into the story. Then a couple of new scenes to write, a few things to shift around, and I also really want to work on my climax. I mentioned that as well in my last video. That was already something I was like, that's gonna have to happen in revisions. That needs some work. I am gonna work on that, but I think a lot of what I felt like wasn't quite solid in my climax had to do with world building stuff that wasn't 100% clear in my head, and character arcs that were a tiny bit vague to me, or I wasn't really sure entirely how to incorporate them in the story. So I'm working on that first, and as those details come to light and as I really figure that stuff out, then the climax is going to be a lot easier to tackle. Then I'd actually like to do a full reread, and as I'm doing my reread, I can do, you know, line edits, and if I wrote something that completely doesn't make sense, I'll fix that as I'm going and stuff. When all of that's done, and only when all of that's done, will I be able to call revisions #1 quits. So I have a lot of work ahead of me. It's daunting, but actually I'm really excited. I've had some kind of up and down days with how I feel about it. I think it's kind of normal to doubt yourself. There is a lot of work to be done, and some days it's felt like a lot more work than other days. But all in all, I'm really confident about my story. I still really do like my story. So even on those down days, it's just kind of a matter of working on what I can work on and then coming back to it with fresh eyes the next day. So all in all, revisions are going really well, and I'm hoping that within the next few months I can have what I need to accomplish accomplished. I don't know if that'll be the case. I'm kind of hoping by the end of summer I can have a new revisions draft. But considering the current circumstances with, you know, quarantine, lockdown, all of that, some other personal stuff that I'm working on right now that's just taking up a lot of time, I'm not going to put too much pressure on myself, but I do really hope, and I'm going to work towards the goal of having revisions 1 done by the end of the summer. So we'll see if I can make that happen. I hope this video was interesting for you and maybe helpful as well if you're currently working on some revisions or if you're about to launch into some revisions at one point soon. Let me know in the comments what you're currently working on, and if you're in the middle of revisions, please let me know how those are going. I really hope they're going well. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you want to see more videos about my novel in the future. I'm planning to do some writing vlogs as I'm doing my revisions, kind of showing you what I'm working on, walking you through kind of step by step any challenges I face as well. I'll talk about in my writing vlogs. I usually get pretty honest in those, for better and for worse. So if you're curious about my writing process as I'm going through revisions, definitely make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, and there will be a writing vlog coming very soon. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will talk to you very soon in another writing video.